Trade routes and tariffs. Hello everybody, Builder Guy here, and welcome back to the channel in a new Victoria 3 Dev Diary number 38. It's been a few weeks since the last Dev Diary that I covered, just because I've been in Europe for a few weeks, so I wasn't able to cover any Dev Diaries. There have been a few interesting ones since then, but instead of recapping those, which I'm sure you've already read or seen videos on, we're going to dive into this latest one that came out today on St. Patrick's Day when I'm recording this. So, trade routes and tariffs. Anybody that knows my opinion on Crusader Kings 3, trade is something in CK3 that I really hope that they upgrade and update and change in future, but hey, this is about Victoria 3. If money is the sinews of war, then trade is the lifeblood of nations, and in no period is this truer than the Victorian era. Victoria 3 takes place in a period of time where the nations of the world pushed this concept further than before. Through a period of industrialization and growing interconnectivity of first homelands and colonies and then among nation-states themselves. The trade routes on the map connecting our nations became the fabric that underpins many of the understandings of our modern world today. That is very true. But what is trade? It may seem obvious to some, but to better understand the systems, we need to make sure we understand the foundations they are built upon. Thus, trade is understood to be the movement of goods between two markets as a means of commercial transaction, so that the other party is effectively paid for their services. Trade is not conducted between businesses and our nations, but is instead conducted through their national markets and by proxy their trade centers. While this may not seem a meaningful distinction, the market and economy of a nation is not synonymous with its national government. So you can't be, say, Prussia and the King of Prussia or the Prussian government and be like, I'm going to trade with Bavaria. It's a little bit different than that. While that government may attempt to influence the economy, it does not always have an absolute degree of control over it. Thus, the trade that goes on in your market is something that you can influence and encourage, or discourage if you like, but never fully control, unless you are the only nation in existence, I guess. While trade takes place between national markets at the behest of players and AI, it is conducted in the trade centers of those respective countries. Trade centers function similarly to urban centers, talked about in a previous Dev Diary. These are not buildings that are constructed manually, but develop as a result of their engaging in trade routes, as they are representative of the many gray areas of industry that necessitate the collection and movement of goods. If you were to create an import route, or route, whatever you want to call it, of goods for your industries, the resulting level of trade centers would develop within your nation. While urban centers tend to develop where you have placed many industrial buildings, trade centers develop in the market capitals and the ports of your nation. While you cannot paint the placement of trade centers outright, you can influence their development by creating ports in states that are naturally suited to such, where infrastructure and POPs are readily available to staff them. So you can influence where your trade centers could develop, but at the end of the day, it's really not entirely up to you. They will build up naturally a little bit more organically, which I do really, really like. And as a government, you can't say, this is where trade will happen. It will probably happen where it makes the most sense. Where there's a port and people, there's likely to be trade and hopefully profit. So here we can see a trade center building in East Anglia. So yearly productivity per employee, average annual wage, employment cash reserves, production method, and the trade routes that kind of go from there. Yes, trade centers must be staffed. Goods do not just appear in one nation from the next, but require the maintenance of bureaucrats, laborers, clerks, and the like to offload and unload cargo, take account of it, tax it, and move it forward. These are, for the most part, privately owned enterprises that normally have capitalists in charge instead of government-run services. Without POP staffing your trade centers, you will find yourself unable to conduct trade in accordance with your aspirations, but that shouldn't be too hard to manage, as trade centers have also been historically known to be centers of migration. Makes sense. The first stop of migrants, both domestic and international, seeking a better life and sometimes finding it. Here, all the goods moving to and from New York means it's easier for Pops to hitch a ride, which makes sense. It's a massive migration center. Trade centers collect revenue on both sides of the routes. They manage in relation to how many goods are moved and how much the routes, I'm alternating between routes and routes, just keep everybody happy, affect the prices in their respective markets. This revenue is allocated to the employees and taxed by the same logic as any industry. So who makes money off your trade is related to your domestic policies in the same way as the rest of your economy. So this is just an extension of your economy, but an incredibly important one. Well, trade is something that every nation can take a part of. How they affect trade in relation to conducting it efficiently, preventing it when it hurts them, or profiting off it when they can, is dependent upon its trade policies, which are in turn dictated how a nation can set its policies of embargoes and tariffs. Yes, that's right, I said tariffs. Cue historical excitement of the fan base. So tariffs. Where at first there was one law category, there are now two: economic system, interventionism, trade policy, protectionism. So you have the economic system and a trade policy. We've done a little restructuring of the economic laws in Victoria 3 since we wrote the Law Dev Diary, where originally your economic system affected both your domestic and international situations. It has been broken into economic systems, which now cover the domestic economy, and trade policy, which covers your international endeavors. As such, trade policy governs how you interact with a customs union, your ability to set embargoes and tariffs, as well as the general efficiency of your conducted trade. Trade policy laws are broken down into four categories of ideology relative to the time period, which interact with each of the economic systems you can put into place domestically. So we've got, let's see, we can see mercantilism, we've got protectionism, free trade, and isolationism. Embargoes represent the ability of a national government to extend its influence in protecting its national market and subsequent interests. Most, if not all, nations can engage in embargoing a good, but their effectiveness of doing such is dependent upon the trade policy the national government is centered around. A government centered around the ideas of protectionism has an easier time implementing a more efficient embargo on goods versus those that are committed to a more mercantilism or free trade policy. Notice I said influence, not authority. While it costs authority to enact taxes domestically, it costs influence to place embargoes, as whether or not they are able to be enforced is dependent upon your ability to influence other nations to respect them. Refusing to make fair trade deals will strain your diplomatic core. Makes sense completely. I like how this is all interconnected, and I do like the fact that it is different. I mean, authority for taxes, influence for embargoes, because one is domestic, and you can exert your authority on domestic policies, whereas you need influence for a more diplomatic international relation. Protectionism means that not only are embargoes easier to maintain, they're also more efficient. So here we can see protectionism, trade policy, part of our laws, plus 25% protected export share, minus 50% embargo cost. So that's huge. Yes, permission to embargo all goods. Yes, customs unions permitted. Yes, allow trade routes or routes. Effects for very low tariffs, plus 20% tariffs on imports, plus 20% tariffs on exports. And now for the potentially more controversial statement: embargoes are not absolute. Sure, you may embargo trade of a specific good into your country, but that's not going to stop it outright, only hinder the ease of its trade. Another nation might try and continue to push goods into your country, but it will certainly require more of an effort to facilitate such. It all depends. In history, there's certainly something we can agree upon. Embargoing something, making it illegal, or hindering its trade reduces the flow of the good, but does not stop it outright if there is a vested interest by another nation and a profit to be made. I mean, just think of going into the 20th century, of course, we're looking at Prohibition. I mean, the flow of Canadian whiskey into the United States was huge. Tariffs are the means where a national government extends its influence as an intermediary in the trade between national markets, if not for the means of protecting its national interests. to at the very least ensure it gets its fair share of the profits that such entails. Tariffs are set on both exports and imports, leaving the national economy because, yes, the government is interested in its fair share, and if it cannot get the revenue by means of a consumption tax, it will find other means. The ratio of this tariff level is dependent on the trade policy set. Makes sense that depending on the trade policy you utilize, your tariff levels then have an upper and lower level. A more mercantilist trade policy would seek to ensure exports exceed imports, so tariffs on imports will undoubtedly be lower. Protectionism is equal in its ratio as it seeks to shelter the domestic economy from booming or busting on either side of the equation. Free trade, well, free trade cares not for tariffs, it seeks to profit through other means. While the laws set the tariff ratio of import-exports, these can be customized further in the budget screen by setting their tax levels. Tax levels don't just bring in revenues, but offer incentives to your economic actors, your pops. Lower tariffs encourage trade, while higher tariffs will hinder their efficiency because, well, if the nation is getting a bigger cut, how motivated can you expect the pop to be in engaging in trade? So we look at high tariffs here. A higher tariff means minimizing the profit to be had by business and disincentivizing trade. So high tariffs are the trade policy of mercantilism. Affects minus 15% trade route competitiveness, plus 42.5% import tariffs on import, and 25% on export. Predicted revenue is 3.13K. Change in revenue from current tariff level is plus 627. So you can see here, based on the revenue through tariff levels, you gain a significant amount of money there. So how do treaty ports play into these systems, as they certainly existed during the time period? Treaty ports are a means to ensure that you have access to a national market despite such embargoes and tariffs. They are a wedge in the barriers to trade another nation may put up so the goods may be funneled out of the market. Treaty ports have the special function that they permit the bypassing of embargoes and tariffs set in land-adjacent markets through trading. They are a more permanent means of opening the market to your access, but in the same vein also require a more permanent investment. Since treaty ports are first and foremost ports, they will certainly become trade centers and will require the infrastructure and staffing to function. As you invest in this profitable endeavor, be aware that you will need to protect such from the eyes of the imperialist nations who might seek to take it away from you. So here, at GameStar, Portugal finds itself holding the treaty port of Macau, a very profitable trade endeavor. But will such profits attract the attention of greater powers? Yeah, could make sense. So how do customs unions come into play here? If you recall from the previous developer diary, customs unions are an agreement between one or more nations where one nation agrees to subject itself to another's national market. By agreeing to subject your national market to another nation, you're agreeing to take on the structure set in place by their economic system and policies. Interesting. While you are still able to enact trade between that national market and another, you lose the ability to set embargoes on specific goods and tariff policies across the market, but you do receive your contributing share of the profit of such tariffs. Very long sentence there. But basically, you still have some influence, but not as much as you would otherwise if you are not dealing with customs unions. Sometimes this development can be beneficial, sometimes it can majorly hurt your national sources of income. As the previous dev diary goes to great lengths to summarize, it depends. And that's a bit about trade, tariffs, and more. I may not have succeeded in delivering a concise explanation this time, but it's certainly a shorter one. Next week is going to be the Kaiser himself, Johann Jons, talk about shipping lanes. Let the fan base craft their own conspiracy theories about whether or not we are being literal with that one. Shipping lanes, so it's going to be like Stellaris in Victoria. So this is the lane you can take. So, I mean, it was a very wordy summary of basic trade. The key thing here, of course, are your policies, the direction you want to go, the semi-organic development of trade centers as a key part of your trade, And then shipping lanes will, of course, be interesting next time. I'd like to know your thoughts on trade in Victoria 3 as it is kind of laid out here in this dev diary. And as always, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to not miss out on any future Victoria 3 content. Till next time, I'm Realm Builder Guy, and I will talk to you soon.